Reunion, Leadership, and the Longing to Belong presents a new way of thinking about leadership that can be applied at work, in the community, or even at home. Stay tuned to learn about our need for belonging and how fostering belonging makes us better leaders. I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered, and today I'll talk with Jerry Colonna. He's a leading executive coach who uses the skills he learned as a venture capitalist to help entrepreneurs. He's a co-founder and CEO of Reboot, the executive coaching and leadership development company, host of the Reboot podcast, and the author of Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. He joins us to talk about reunion, leadership, and the longing to belong. Jerry, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on the show.
In the introduction to the book, and I'm going to look down so I can get this quote right, our traditional definitions of leadership maintain systemic oppression and othering. And you also note that it's time for a new definition of leadership. So let's start with the first part of that. How does our current definition of leadership, the current way it's being carried out, fail? What are its failings?
Well, look at the roots of our current modern definitions of leadership. They really come from the industrial age. They come from the late 19th century, and it has a command and control hierarchy that is so prevalent that we think it's always been that way, and we assume that that's the case. And separate from even the topic that we talk about in Reunion, one of the things I often speak about with my clients is the burden of that hierarchy, the burden of that right side up pyramidal structure. And part of the burden is that it places all of the emphasis on the pinnacle of the leader, of the apex of that pyramid. What it does is it sort of projects this notion of power down. Now, there are certain instances where that's perfectly appropriate. As I often joke, for example, you don't want to pause and figure out who's in charge in the middle of a fire, right? But for the most part, most of the decisions in an organization really should be bottoms up. They should be where folks are closest to the customer. And so we flip that pyramid. That's, in that way, traditional leadership structures maintain not only systemic oppression, but a kind of a system of almost infantilizing our staff.
So what does a new definition of leadership look like?
Well, take a look at the tension that people feel right now. There's this constant tension where, and we can blame it on a generational thing. You and I think, are boomers. I don't want to assume anything, but we're boomers, right? And just behind us are the millennials and the Gen X. And every generation is looking backwards and saying, these people feel so entitled, blah, blah. What are they really talking about? What they're talking about are pushing up against the strictures that constrain them from actually being full human beings. Now, when we add to that the very real and very necessary changes in our society that are going on, you have this really powerful force that's underway that says those of us who hold power have a moral and ethical responsibility to respond to the lack of a sense of belonging out in the world at large. It doesn't mean that we have a responsibility to fix everything. It just means we can no longer pretend that everything's all right. Because it's not. And our children know everything is not all right.
So let's talk about the word reunion. It's right there in the title of your book. What does it mean in the context of this new vision of leadership?
I'm really glad you asked that. The word reunion came to me while I was writing the book. And then a few months after that, I stumbled upon this beautiful poem by Bell Hooks, the late Bell Hooks. And in it, she says, when angels speak of love, they tell us all things are union and reunion. And at that moment, I was just stopped in my tracks. Because what I realized, what I was grappling for, was this almost nostalgic, lost sense not of, say, in America where our differences were plastered over in a false sense of a melting pot, but almost like this visceral bodily sense that there was a time when actually we were not so divided. It's almost, to get metaphorical for a moment, it's almost like the Garden of Eden, like the time when we were actually together. So for me, what reunion represents is a very hopeful stance. It's, holy moly, there is a time when we were together. Can we get back there? And then, of course, there are all these subtle plays about reuniting with my past and reuniting with your past and that sort of thing. But that's the essence of what I'm trying to do with that word.
Another key word that you talk about is belonging. So let's talk a bit more about how we as leaders can create that sense of belonging to the betterment of our staff, but also the organization, whether that be in a business setting, a community setting, or maybe even in a home setting.
In my first book, Reboot, I talk about how we, in our pursuit of growing up and becoming adults, that we're really motivated by this feeling, this wish for love, safety, and belonging. And what I tried to do was sort of dive deep. What does it mean to feel viscerally, unequivocally, that you belong? There's so much pressure right now going on about, affirmative action efforts and DEI efforts and what do we do here and what do we do there? Let's get back to first principle. What do people want? They want to know that they're safe. They want to know that they're surrounded by people who value them, who appreciate their differences, who understand that they may view the world in a different way and that it's okay. Now, from a business perspective, if we have a group of colleagues who each feel in some sense that way, and they're talented, magic happens. Magic happens. So for me, part of this is unleashing that magic that comes about when everybody in the group feels unconditionally that they belong there.
But you point out, before we can get there as a leader, we have to know ourselves.
Yeah.
And because you write that, we're not who we think we are, basically. And we have to do some work to figure out who we are. And I think you called it like radical self-inquiry. Explain a bit more about how that works and why it's important that we do that work.
Yeah. So again, the term radical self-inquiry is a term I coined a number of years ago to describe the kind of work that I do as a coach, the kind of work that I and my colleagues do. And put simply, it's the process by which the masks that we wear to get through the day are slowly, skillfully, and compassionately, compassion is a key word there, taken down so we're not hiding anymore. And so, for example, it answers a question like, what do I need to say that I haven't been saying? And why do I react with anger when a colleague disappoints me? Why do I not react with curiosity? What's the thread? Okay, so that work is really critical for those of us who hold power, those of us who hold leadership positions, so that we're not hurting people with our unconscious behaviors. So that's step one. As it relates to this notion of answering the longing to belonging, understanding to whom and to where we belong becomes a foundational effort. Why do we have such discomfort with so many efforts that have been going on for 30, 40, 50 years at trying to create inclusivity? Because they're performative. Because they feel like we're ticking boxes. Because it feels like they're not rooted in something that has meaning and reality. So reunion with the disowned parts of ourselves, our ancestors, the dismembered parts of our own psyche, is really critical to creating those conditions for that inquiry process, that larger inquiry process.
And part of this process, you point out, is also looking back at our ancestors. Where did we come from? What is the environment that we were raised in? And also coming to grips with the idea that the status quo, the thing you're talking about changing, has actually benefited us.
God bless you for saying that. That's right. That's right. And, you know, it's a painful journey to look at the ways in which the systems in the world that we say we don't want to see may have benefited us. It's understandable that it evokes a defensive guilt. But the problem, Dan, with defensive guilt is it shuts down curiosity. It shuts down inquiry. It shuts down ultimately compassion and empathy. We have a mess on the southern border of the United States right now. And I blame all sides in this mess. How many of us have immigrant forebears? How many of us have immigrant ancestors? If we can remember why they came, if we can remember what the conditions were that they left and what the conditions were when they came, maybe, just maybe, the policies we create can be rooted in compassion and empathy. I'm not saying let everybody in. What I'm saying is let's lead with empathy. Let's not let a child crawl through razor wire in the middle of a river. I don't know what the answer is, but I know that's not the answer.
But in trying to find that answer, it all depends on how you approach it. And it sounds like let's start with the basis of empathy and then go from there, as opposed to that top-down sort of authoritarian approach that we often see. Another thing that you point in the book, and you give an example, there's lots of examples and stories in this book, I should point out, that illustrate the points you're trying to make. And one of them that kind of moved me was a lady who stood up and said she wants to know that she matters. And, going through this whole process of examining your life, looking at where your ancestors come from, you've gone through that, can raise a lot of questions. Like you said, it can be difficult and painful. And when you get through the end of it, you might wonder, where do I play out in this picture? Do I really matter? Or am I just kind of the end result of this ongoing process?
I'm moved that you remember that story and that you were moved by that story. And if you remember that towards the end of that story, what I asked that woman to do, she stood up at a book reading. And what I asked her to do was imagine what her ancestors felt about her. Was she some sort of random accident? Or was she this other word that I think is equally powerful, descendant? And when she connected to the sense that she was a descendant, that in so many ways she was the result, she was the wished for expression of this sacrifice. She reunited, to use that word, with the feelings that her ancestors had, just through active imagination. To push back against all of the feelings in the world that say you are less than and you don't matter. You speak about empathy. We were speaking about empathy, and my heart still feels heavy when I think of her. 4 years later, wondering, because of a work environment, is she getting paid enough? Do I matter? I don't want anybody to question whether they matter. Call me too sensitive or whatever, but I think that's our moral responsibility, is to worry about each other, to take care of each other. That's community. That's reunion.
We have a limited amount of time to talk. There's no way we can cover everything, but a couple of things I do want to give you the opportunity to talk about. And one is how the book is organized and kind of a quick overview of what people are going to find here in the book, because you take people through a process to get toward the goal of having a better way of leading people.
Yeah, and I'll say a word about that process. My first book was written retrospectively. This is what I learned in my process of growing up. In this book, I'm documenting a process that I myself went through. So when I suggest the process here, it's a process that I have gone through. And I can assert it worked for me in the sense of having been changed. And it is a process. It's a process of, first and foremost, connecting not only with the stories and the myths of our ancestors, but the reality of their experience. Who are they? Why did they leave where they left, if they left from someplace? What was their experience when they got here? How were they treated? How did they turn around and treat other people? And then what were the parts of ourselves that we sort of deny in this sort of bid to fit in? This kind of, as I said before, plastering over in the myth of the melting pot. Yeah, no, we're all here. The truth is there's always a tension between being an individual and being in community. And the thing that I think is really critical to remember is that conforming is not community. Conforming, pushing down the parts of you that people don't really like in order to fit in, takes away from community. And lastly, it's connecting with and understanding and seeing the other people in our society, what I refer to as the disinherited. That process then lays the foundation for us to look outward and say, what do I have to do to make the world the place that I know it can be? That's the key, and that's the process.
Well, to learn more, the book is Reunion, Leadership and the Longing to Belong by Jerry Colonna. Jerry, thank you very much for talking with me today.
Oh, thank you, Dan, for having me, and thank you for such thoughtful questions.
If you'd like to purchase Reunion, I've placed a link for you in the description below. And if you'd like to see more videos about books and their authors on a wide variety of topics, be sure to subscribe, like, and click on the bell to be notified about future programs. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.